Late autumn, 1944. A German intelligence facility in the western Rhineland. Luftwaffe analysts studied a series of field reports that had arrived over the preceding weeks from 3 separate theatres of operations. Each report described the same phenomenon. Each had been flagged as requiring urgent technical assessment, and each, on its face, appeared to be impossible. The first set of reports came from anti-aircraft battery commanders stationed along the English Channel coast. Their assignment had been straightforward. Fiesler 103 flying bombs, the so-called Vergeltungswaffe I, were being launched against London in enormous numbers. Allied anti-aircraft batteries positioned along the southern coast of England had been attempting to shoot these weapons down for months. In the early weeks of the campaign, British and American gunners had struggled. The flying bombs moved at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, at altitudes that made interception difficult. German analysts had calculated that conventional anti-aircraft fire would destroy perhaps 1 bomb in every 10. The mathematics were simple. The Vone was a small, fast-moving target. Proximity-timed shells had to detonate within a narrow window to have any effect. The odds favoured the weapon, not the gunner, but the latest reports told a different story. Allied anti-aircraft batteries had suddenly, over the span of what appeared to be days rather than weeks, begun destroying flying bombs at rates that defied every calculation German ordnance experts had made. The interception rate had climbed from figures so low they barely registered to numbers so high that entire salvos of flying bombs were being swatted from the sky before reaching their targets. The analysts checked the figures twice. They requested confirmation from observation posts. The confirmation came back unchanged. The second set of reports arrived from the Pacific Theatre, forwarded through Japanese naval intelligence channels shared with Berlin. Japanese pilots operating against the American fleet had reported a dramatic and unexplained increase in the accuracy of American shipboard anti-aircraft fire. Aircraft that should have penetrated defensive screens were being destroyed at distances and altitudes that suggested the Americans had fundamentally changed something about the way their shells behaved. Experienced Japanese aviators who had survived dozens of previous engagements were not returning from missions against American carrier task forces. The third set of reports was the most troubling of all, because it came from the Western Front, from German ground forces engaged in direct combat. Infantry officers in contact with American units reported artillery shells that exploded before striking the ground. Not on impact, not after burying themselves in earth and detonating a fraction of a second later. These shells were detonating in mid-air, 15 to 20 meters above the ground, showering shrapnel downward onto troops in foxholes and trenches that had been designed to protect against conventional ground-burst artillery. Soldiers who had survived years of combat on the eastern and western fronts reported that these airbursts were unlike anything they had experienced. There was no warning. There was no crater to signal where the next round would land. There was only the sound of the shell arriving, and then a lethal hail of fragments raining down from above. What German intelligence did not know, and what they would not fully understand until after the war, was that all 3 reports described the same weapon. Not a new gun. Not a new explosive. Not a new aiming system, a new fuse, a device no larger than a man's fist, housed in the nose cone of an otherwise ordinary artillery shell that could detect the presence of a target and detonate itself at precisely the right moment without any human intervention. The Americans called it the VT fuse. The letters stood for variable time, a deliberately meaningless designation chosen to conceal the weapon's true nature. Its real name was the proximity fuse, and it was one of the 3 most closely guarded secrets of the Second World War, ranked alongside radar and the atomic bomb. The story of how it came to exist, how it was kept secret, and how it changed the nature of combat on land, at sea, and in the air, is a story of American scientific ingenuity operating under wartime pressure to solve a problem that the finest minds in Europe had declared unsolvable. The problem was as old as anti-aircraft warfare itself, and by 1940 it had become one of the most urgent tactical challenges facing every combatant nation. The issue was devastatingly simple. Shooting down an aircraft with a ground-based gun required the shell to detonate close enough to the target to destroy it with blast or fragmentation. But aircraft moved at speeds of 300 miles per hour or more, at altitudes of thousands of feet, on unpredictable flight paths. A shell fired from the ground took seconds to reach altitude. In those seconds, the target moved hundreds of feet. The gunner had to predict where the aircraft would be at the moment of detonation and set a timed fuse on the shell before firing. This meant that every anti-aircraft shell carried a mechanical clock. The gunner calculated the altitude and bearing of the target, set the fuse to detonate after the estimated number of seconds of flight time, loaded the shell, and fired. If the calculation was correct within a fraction of a second, and if the aircraft did not change speed, altitude, or direction during the shell's flight time, the shell would detonate close enough to do damage. If any of those variables were wrong by even a small margin, the shell would explode harmlessly in empty sky. The statistics were grim. During the early years of the war, it took an average of approximately 2,500 conventional anti-aircraft shells to bring down a single aircraft. Some estimates placed the figure even higher. The mathematics of the problem were not in the gunner's favor. The volume of sky that a shell's fragmentation pattern could cover was tiny compared to the volume of sky through which the target might pass. Anti-aircraft fire was, in practical terms, an exercise in controlled futility. Enormous quantities of ammunition were expended to produce statistically marginal results. The British had recognized this problem early and had begun theoretical work on a fuse that could solve it. The concept was elegant. Instead of relying on a mechanical timer set before firing, what if the fuse itself could detect when it was close to a target and detonate automatically at the optimal moment? Such a device would eliminate the need for precise timing calculations. It would compensate for errors in range estimation, for evasive maneuvers by the target, for wind and atmospheric conditions. A proximity sensing fuse would transform anti-aircraft gunnery from a game of chance into something approaching precision. The British shared this concept with the Americans in the autumn of 1940 as part of the Tizard mission, one of the most consequential technology transfers in the history of warfare. Sir Henry Tizard and a small team of British scientists carried a black deed box across the Atlantic containing the crown jewels of British military research. Included in that box were plans for the cavity magnetron that would revolutionize radar and early theoretical work on a proximity fuse. The British had the concept. What they lacked was the industrial capacity and the safe distance from enemy bombing to develop it. America had both. The project was assigned to the newly created Section T of the National Defense Research Committee, housed at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. Its director was Merle Tuve, a physicist from the Carnegie Institution who had already made significant contributions to nuclear physics. Tuve was not a military man. He was a scientist, and he approached the proximity fuse not as an ordnance problem but as a physics problem. The question was not how to build a better timer. The question was how to build a tiny radio station that could survive being fired from a gun. The principle Tuve's team settled on was deceptively simple. A miniature radio transmitter, powered by a small battery, would be built into the nose of the shell. Upon firing, the transmitter would begin broadcasting a continuous radio signal at a specific frequency. As the shell approached a target, whether that target was an aircraft, the ground, or any other reflective surface, the radio waves would bounce off the target and return to a receiver built into the same fuse. The strength of the returning signal would increase as the shell drew closer. When the signal reached a predetermined threshold, indicating that the shell was within lethal fragmentation range, the fuse would trigger detonation. No timer, no human calculation, no estimate of altitude or flight time. The shell would, in effect, decide for itself when to explode. The principle was simple. The engineering was nearly impossible, and every engineer who examined the specifications said so. The fuse had to contain a radio transmitter, a radio receiver, an amplifier, a thyrotron switching tube, and a power supply, all within a package small enough to fit in the nose cone of a standard artillery shell. The total volume available was roughly that of a pint glass. Every component had to survive the shock of being fired from a gun barrel, a force that subjected the fuse to accelerations of approximately 20,000 times the force of gravity. The shell also spun at tremendous speed as it left a rifled barrel, subjecting every internal component to centrifugal forces that would tear apart any conventionally assembled electronic device. Vacuum tubes, the essential components of any radio circuit in that era, were famously fragile. They were glass envelopes containing delicate internal elements suspended on thin wire supports. They shattered under far less stress than a coffee cup dropped on a hard floor. They failed when jostled during shipping. They burned out from heat. They cracked from vibration. WWII's team was being asked to build vacuum tubes that could survive forces equivalent to being hit by a locomotive and then immediately begin functioning as precision radio components. The challenge drove some of the most creative engineering of the 20th century. WWII recruited physicists, engineers, and glassblowers from across the country. The team at the Applied Physics Laboratory worked with an intensity that matched the Manhattan Project in urgency, if not in scale. They experimented with new glass formulations that could withstand extreme shock. They redesigned tube geometries so that internal elements supported each other under acceleration rather than tearing free. They reduced the size of the tubes until they were no larger than a woman's thimble, each one a precision-crafted marvel of miniaturized electronics. The power supply presented its own seemingly impossible challenge. The fuse needed electricity to operate its radio circuits, but conventional batteries would be destroyed by the forces of launch. Even if they survived, a battery sitting in a shell for months in an ammunition depot would drain itself long before it was needed. WWII's team developed a wet cell battery that would remain completely inert during storage, but activate automatically when the shell was fired. The force of launch would break a glass ampule inside the battery casing, allowing the electrolyte to flood the battery cells. Within a fraction of a second after leaving the gun barrel, the fuse would have power, and the tiny radio transmitter would begin its work. The battery needed to operate for only a few seconds, the duration of the shell's flight to its target. It was an elegant solution to a problem that had no elegant answer. There was an additional concern that occupied WWII's engineers. The fuse had to include a safety mechanism that prevented it from detonating the shell prematurely, inside the gun barrel, or within a few hundred feet of the muzzle. A proximity fuse that triggered on the first radio reflection it detected, which might be the gun barrel itself, or the deck of the ship from which it was fired, would be more dangerous to the crew than to the enemy. The team designed an arming delay that prevented the fuse from activating until the shell had traveled a safe distance from the firing position. Only after that distance was reached would the radio circuit begin searching for a target. By 1942, Section T had produced working prototypes. Testing was conducted under conditions of extraordinary secrecy. The project was classified at a level comparable to the Manhattan Project. Personnel were forbidden from discussing their work. Test firings were conducted at remote locations. The fear was specific and justified. If the enemy obtained a single intact proximity fuse and understood its operating principle, they could develop countermeasures or, worse, replicate the technology. A proximity fuse in the nose of a German anti-aircraft shell would have devastated Allied bomber formations over Europe. The first combat deployment came in the Pacific, and it came with a restriction that revealed the depth of American concern about secrecy. Proximity fuses were initially authorized only for use against aircraft over open water. The reasoning was that shells that missed their targets and failed to self-destruct would fall into the ocean, where they could not be recovered by the enemy. Under no circumstances were proximity fuzzes to be used over land, where an unexploded shell might be found, examined, and reverse-engineered. The cruiser, USS Helena, is credited with the first combat use of the proximity fuser in January of 1943 during operations in the waters near Guadalcanal. The ship's anti-aircraft batteries, loaded with shells fitted with the new fuses, engaged incoming Japanese aircraft during one of the frequent air raids that characterized the campaign for the Solomon Islands. The results were immediate and dramatic. Aircraft that would have required dozens or hundreds of rounds to bring down with conventionally fused shells were being destroyed with a fraction of the ammunition expenditure. Gun crews, accustomed to watching their rounds explode harmlessly above or below attacking aircraft, saw their shells detonating at precisely the altitude of the incoming planes, producing bursts of fragmentation that tore wings and fuselages apart. The proximity fuse did not merely improve anti-aircraft accuracy, it transformed the fundamental calculus of aerial attack against naval vessels. Word spread through the fleet with the speed of any revelation that meant the difference between life and death. Other ships received proximity-fused ammunition and reported similar results. During the subsequent campaigns across the Central Pacific, through the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, and the Marianas, American naval anti-aircraft fire became progressively more lethal. Each engagement produced data that confirmed the fuse's effectiveness and identified refinements that could improve it further. The ammunition was still classified at the highest levels, and crews were not told how the fuzzes worked. They were told only that the new ammunition was more effective, and that under no circumstances were unfired rounds to be discarded overboard or allowed to fall into enemy hands. Japanese pilots operating in the Solomon Islands and across the Central Pacific began reporting to their commanders that American anti-aircraft fire had changed in ways that defied their training and experience. The descriptions were consistent across multiple units and engagements. Shells were detonating at precisely the right altitude, as though the Americans could see exactly where each aircraft was and command their shells to explode at that exact point. Experienced aviators who had learned to evade anti-aircraft fire by varying their altitude and approach angle found that the new shells seemed to follow them, adjusting to their maneuvers in ways that timed fuses could not. Evasive tactics that had saved lives for 2 years were no longer working. The Imperial Japanese Navy attempted to analyze the phenomenon. Intelligence officers reviewed pilot reports and tried to reconcile what was being described with known anti-aircraft technology. Some concluded that the Americans had developed a dramatically improved fire control radar system that could predict aircraft positions with unprecedented accuracy. Others speculated that the Americans were using some form of barrage technique with preset detonation altitudes that happened to match Japanese attack profiles. A small number of analysts suggested that the fusing mechanism itself must have changed, but the possibility that each individual shell carried its own detection and detonation system does not appear to have been seriously considered. The miniaturization required was, by the standards of 1943 electronics, beyond what Japanese engineers believed possible. Japan's own electronics industry, which was sophisticated in many respects, had nothing comparable in development. As the Pacific Campaign progressed through 1943 and into 1944, the impact of the proximity fuse became increasingly devastating. The pattern repeated at Tarawa, at Kwajalein, at Eniwetok, and at Saipan. Each island assault brought Japanese air attacks against the invasion fleet, and each engagement demonstrated the growing lethality of American anti-aircraft defenses. Japanese air groups that had been formidable fighting forces at the start of the Pacific War were being ground down by attrition rates that no air arm could sustain. Replacement pilots, trained hastily to fill the growing gaps in squadron rosters, were even more vulnerable than the veterans they replaced. They lacked the experience to vary their approach tactics, and the proximity fuse punished predictability with lethal efficiency. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, the engagement that American pilots would remember as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the combination of proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells and superior American fighter tactics produced losses among Japanese naval aviation that bordered on annihilation. Japanese carriers launched wave after wave of aircraft against the American fleet. The anti-aircraft screens surrounding the American carriers, now equipped with proximity fuses, created a wall of precisely timed detonations that shredded attacking formations before they could reach weapons release range. Of the roughly 373 Japanese carrier aircraft launched during the battle, the vast majority were destroyed. American anti-aircraft fire, augmented by the proximity fuse, accounted for a significant portion of those kills. The losses were not merely tactical, they were strategic. Japan could not replace trained naval aviators at anything approaching the rate at which they were being destroyed. Each engagement against American task forces equipped with proximity-fused ammunition consumed irreplaceable human capital. By late 1944, the quality of Japanese naval aviation had deteriorated to the point where Japan turned to kamikaze tactics, in part because conventionally trained pilots could no longer penetrate American defensive screens. The proximity fuse did not single-handedly cause this shift, but it was one of the critical technologies that made conventional air attack against American naval forces functionally suicidal. The European theatre presented a different challenge and a different opportunity. In the summer of 1944, Germany began its Von flying bomb campaign against London. The Fiesler 103 was an early cruise missile, a pilotless aircraft carrying an 1,800-pound warhead, launched from sites along the French and Dutch coasts. The flying bombs crossed the English Channel at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet, at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. They were small, fast, and flew straight and level, making them difficult targets for conventional anti-aircraft fire, but theoretically ideal targets for a fuse that could detect proximity and detonate automatically. The initial Allied response to the Vosne campaign was frustratingly ineffective. Anti-aircraft batteries positioned along the southern English coast engaged the flying bombs with conventionally fused shells. The results were poor. The bombs were small enough and fast enough that the timing errors inherent in mechanical fuses allowed the vast majority to pass through defensive fire unscathed. Fighter aircraft had better success, but even they struggled with the speed and altitude of the weapons. In the first weeks of the campaign, a distressing proportion of the launched bombs were reaching London, killing civilians and damaging infrastructure. The decision to deploy proximity fuses against the V-1s required overcoming the security restriction that had confined the weapon to use over water. The flying bombs crossed the coast and flew over English soil. Shells that missed would land in the English countryside, where they could theoretically be recovered by German agents or, more realistically, be examined by personnel who might inadvertently compromise the secret. But the scale of the Vosne threat and the civilian casualties it was producing overrode security concerns. Proximity fuses were authorized for anti-aircraft use against flying bombs over land. The transformation was immediate and measurable. Before the introduction of proximity fuses, anti-aircraft batteries were destroying roughly one flying bomb in every 4 or 5 engaged. Within days of switching to proximity-fused ammunition, the destruction rate climbed dramatically. During one period, in late August of 1944, anti-aircraft batteries, equipped with proximity fuses, were destroying approaching flying bombs, at rates approaching 8 out of every 10 engaged. On the best days, the rate climbed even higher. The improvement was not incremental. It was a transformation so complete that the Vosne campaign, which had been a genuine strategic threat to British morale and industrial output, was effectively neutralized as a weapon of war. German intelligence monitored the rapidly improving Allied interception rates with growing alarm. The flying bomb campaign had been conceived as a weapon that would terrorize London into political pressure for a negotiated peace. The calculations had assumed that conventional anti-aircraft defenses could not significantly reduce the number of bombs reaching their targets. Those calculations were now catastrophically wrong, and German analysts could not explain why. Reports from agents and aerial reconnaissance confirmed that the British had not dramatically increased the number of anti-aircraft batteries along the coast. The guns were the same guns. The positions were the same positions. Something about the ammunition had changed, and German intelligence could not determine what. The most dramatic chapter of the proximity fuse story, and the one that would produce the most visceral reactions from enemy soldiers, came in December of 1944. On the 16th of that month, Germany launched its massive Ardennes offensive, the operation known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. German forces attacked through the forested hills of Belgium and Luxembourg, achieving complete tactical surprise against thinly held American positions. In the early days of the offensive, German forces advanced rapidly, threatening to split the Allied line and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The crisis prompted a decision that had been debated for months. General Eisenhower authorized the use of proximity fuses in ground-burst artillery for the first time. Until this moment, proximity fuses had been restricted to anti-aircraft use. The concern had always been the same. An unexploded proximity-fused shell landing on enemy-held territory could be recovered and reverse-engineered. But the bulge was an emergency. German infantry was advancing in dense formations through open ground and forested terrain. Conventional artillery with impact fuzzes was effective, but limited. A shell that struck the ground created a crater and threw fragmentation outward in a roughly horizontal pattern. Soldiers in foxholes, behind walls, or in trenches were partially protected. The geometry of ground-burst explosions left dead space directly above the target. A proximity fuse changed that geometry entirely. Set to detonate at an altitude of roughly 15 to 20 meters above the ground, an artillery shell would explode in the air, sending its fragmentation pattern downward and outward in a lethal cone. There was no dead space. There was no protection in a foxhole. A trench that would shelter a soldier from a ground-burst explosion became a killing zone when the shell exploded above it. The shrapnel came from overhead, penetrating every position that lacked overhead cover. The effect on German forces in the Ardennes was devastating and immediate. Infantry formations that had been advancing with confidence through terrain, they believed, offered adequate natural cover, were suddenly subjected to artillery fire that seemed to reach into every concealed position. German soldiers reported that the American shells appeared to be guided, that they exploded at exactly the height needed to maximize casualties, that there was no defense against them. Post-war interrogations of German prisoners captured during the Bulge revealed consistent descriptions of confusion, terror, and a conviction that the Americans had developed some form of controlled detonation that bordered on the supernatural. German officers familiar with conventional artillery were particularly disturbed. They understood how impact fuses worked. They understood how timed fuses worked, and they knew that timed airbursts were theoretically possible but practically inaccurate. Timed fuses required precise calculation of the shell's flight time, and even small errors in timing would result in detonation too high or too low, or after the shell had already struck the ground. The consistency of the American airbursts was what baffled them. Every shell appeared to detonate at exactly the same height above the ground, regardless of terrain, range, or weather conditions. This kind of precision was, by German engineering standards, not achievable with mechanical timing. The word that appears most frequently in German accounts from the Ardennes when describing the experience of proximity-fused artillery is a word that translates roughly as inexplicable. Soldiers who had survived years of Soviet artillery bombardments on the Eastern Front, some of the heaviest concentrations of firepower in the history of warfare, described the American airbursts as something qualitatively different. Soviet artillery was terrifying in its volume. American proximity-fused artillery was terrifying in its precision. There was no randomness to it. There was no wasted, destructive energy plowing into empty ground. Every detonation occurred at the optimal killing height, and the effect was felt in positions that had previously been considered safe. The use of proximity fuses in the Ardennes expanded rapidly as ammunition stocks permitted. American artillery batteries that had been firing conventional impact-fused rounds switched to proximity-fused ammunition and reported immediate increases in the effectiveness of their fire. Forward observers noted that German formations that had been advancing under conventional fire broke and retreated when proximity-fused rounds began falling. The psychological effect was as significant as the physical effect. German soldiers learned that there was no cover from these shells. Foxholes did not protect. Forests did not protect. The tree burst effect in forested areas was particularly devastating. Proximity-fused shells detonating in the canopy above produced a rain of metal fragments, combined with lethal wooden splinters from shattered tree trunks and branches, turning the forest itself into a weapon. As the war in Europe entered its final months in early 1945, proximity fuses became standard issue for American artillery across the Western Front. The experience in the Ardennes had demonstrated the weapon's effectiveness so conclusively that demand from artillery units far outstripped the available supply. Battery commanders who had used proximity-fused ammunition requested it by name and protested when conventional ammunition was substituted. Forward observers learned to call specifically for proximity-fused fire when engaging enemy infantry in the open or in prepared positions, reserving impact-fused rounds for targets that required direct hits, such as bunkers and armored vehicles. The psychological dimension of the weapon cannot be overstated. German soldiers captured in the weeks following the initial use of proximity fuses in the Ardennes described a specific and consistent form of demoralization. Against conventional artillery, a soldier could take measures to improve his chances. He could dig deeper. He could reinforce his position. He could read the pattern of incoming fire and move to areas that seemed less targeted. Against proximity-fused airbursts, none of these measures worked. The shells did not care how deep the foxhole was. They did not care about the pattern of previous impacts. They detonated overhead with a consistency that removed the element of chance that every soldier relied upon to maintain hope. The randomness of conventional artillery, terrible as it was, at least allowed for the possibility of survival through luck or preparation. Proximity-fused airbursts replaced randomness with precision, and the psychological effect of that replacement was shattering. German forces retreating through the Rhineland, the Ruhr, and into the German heartland faced artillery fire that their doctrine and training had not prepared them for. Field fortifications that would have provided adequate protection against conventional artillery were death traps under proximity-fused airbursts. Towns and villages that German forces attempted to defend became particularly costly. The stone walls and timber roofs of European buildings, which offered meaningful protection against ground-burst shells and small arms fire, were penetrated from above by the downward rain of fragments from airbursts. German units attempting to use buildings as strongpoints found that the Americans could render those positions untenable without having to destroy the structures themselves. The Hürtgen forest and the fighting in the dense woodlands east of the Rhine provided some of the most harrowing examples of the fuse's effect. Proximity-fused shells entering a forest canopy detonated when they sensed the mass of the trees above them. The resulting airburst occurred at treetop height, sending a lethal combination downward. Steel shell fragments, which were devastating on their own, were joined by massive wooden splinters torn from shattered tree trunks and branches. These wooden projectiles, some of them as long as a man's forearm and sharpened to points by the force of the explosion, were capable of inflicting wounds as severe as shell fragments. The forest, which German soldiers had chosen as a defensive position precisely because it offered concealment and cover, became the most dangerous environment on the battlefield. The trees that were supposed to protect them were being turned into weapons by American artillery. The adaptation that might have mitigated the weapons' effects, the construction of heavily reinforced overhead cover on all fighting positions, required time, materials, and engineering effort that German forces in retreat simply did not have. Building a position with sufficient overhead protection to withstand a proximity-fused airburst required thick timber or concrete, materials that were in short supply and took hours or days to put in place. German forces that were being pushed back daily, sometimes hourly, could not construct such positions before being forced to abandon them. The weapon exploited a vulnerability that was inherent in the German strategic situation. An army in retreat cannot build fortifications fast enough to counter a weapon that negates field fortifications. German intelligence eventually developed a partial understanding of what they were facing. Captured ammunition and examination of shell fragments revealed the presence of electronic components in the fuse mechanisms. By early 1945, German ordnance experts had deduced the basic operating principle, but understanding the principle and developing either a countermeasure or a copy were entirely different problems. Germany's electronics industry, already strained beyond capacity producing radar and communications equipment under Allied bombing, had no spare capacity for a crash proximity fuse program. The miniaturized vacuum tubes that were the heart of the American fuse represented a manufacturing capability that German industry could not replicate in the time remaining. The production story behind the proximity fuse was, in its own right, a testament to American industrial capacity that mirrored the broader war production miracle. Section T had solved the scientific problem by 1942. But producing millions of fuses, each containing miniature vacuum tubes, batteries, radio components, and precision-assembled detonation circuits, required a manufacturing effort of enormous scale and exacting improvement in American anti-aircraft fire as one of the factors that had made conventional air attack unsustainable. American General George Patton, whose Third Army had used proximity-fused artillery to devastating effect during the Bulge and the subsequent advance into Germany, called the proximity fuse the greatest technological development of the war, save perhaps for the atomic bomb. The significance of the proximity fuse extended beyond its immediate tactical effects. It represented a new category of weapon, one in which the munition itself carried the intelligence to determine the optimal moment of its own detonation. Every guided weapon, every smart bomb, every precision munition deployed in every conflict since 1945 traces its conceptual lineage to the small radio transmitter that Merle Tuve's team built into the nose of an artillery shell in a laboratory at Johns Hopkins University. The fuse did not merely improve existing weapons, it introduced the principle that a weapon could sense its environment and act autonomously. That principle would reshape warfare for the next 80 years and counting. The German intelligence analysts in their Rhineland facility never did produce a satisfactory explanation for what they were seeing in those field reports from late 1944. They identified the symptoms accurately. They documented the effects with the thoroughness that characterized German military bureaucracy. They noted the impossible accuracy, the consistent detonation heights, the devastating effectiveness against targets that should have been protected. They compiled the reports, cross-referenced the data, and forwarded their assessments up the chain of command. What they could not do was accept that the Americans, the nation whose industrial output they had once dismissed as quantity without quality, cars and refrigerators rather than precision instruments, had produced a piece of electronic engineering so advanced that it fit inside a shell casing and survived forces that would flatten a tank. The fuse was smaller than a pint glass. It cost less than the price of a modest dinner. It contained 5 miniaturized vacuum tubes, a radio transmitter, a radio receiver, a battery that built itself in a fraction of a second, and a safety mechanism that armed only after the shell was safely away from the gun, and it contained more sophisticated electronics than most German military equipment produced during the entire war. The proximity fuse entered the Second World War as a secret so closely held that most American soldiers who benefited from it never knew it existed. It left the war as one of the decisive technological advantages that shortened the conflict and saved lives on every front where it was deployed. The Japanese learned what it could do against aircraft. The Germans learned what it could do against infantry. Both learned the same lesson. American industrial and scientific capability, when unleashed under wartime urgency, could solve problems that the rest of the world's engineers had declared impossible, and could do so on a scale that turned laboratory vision. The program eventually involved more than 150 companies and produced approximately 22 million fuses by the end of the war. Each fuse contained roughly 130 individual components, and every one of those components had to function perfectly after being subjected to forces that would destroy most electronic equipment manufactured in that era. The quality control requirements were among the most stringent in American wartime manufacturing. A fuse that failed to function was merely wasteful, one wasted shell among millions. A fuse that functioned prematurely, detonating inside the gun barrel or within lethal range of the firing crew, was catastrophic. A fuse that detonated late, after passing the target, was useless. The tolerances demanded of assembly workers, many of them women who had entered the manufacturing workforce for the first time during the war, were measured in thousandths of an inch. Production lines were designed with inspection stations at every critical assembly point. Completed fuses were subjected to simulated firing tests, vibration tests, and electronic function tests before being approved for shipment to combat units. The Crosley Corporation, Eastman Kodak, the Urco Corporation, the Sylvania Electric Company, and dozens of other firms contributed to the manufacturing program. Many of these companies had no prior experience with military ordnance. They were radio manufacturers, camera companies, electrical component suppliers. The conversion of their production lines to fuse manufacture was itself an achievement of industrial adaptation. Workers who had been assembling civilian radio sets were retrained to assemble devices that had to function in conditions no civilian product would ever face. The fact that they succeeded, and that the rejection rate remained within acceptable limits throughout the war, spoke to a depth of manufacturing expertise that was uniquely American. The scale of the production achievement becomes clearer in comparison. Germany, the nation that had pioneered rocketry, jet propulsion, and guided missile technology, could not produce a proximity fuse. Japan, despite being a major industrial power with a sophisticated electronics sector, could not produce one. Britain, which had originated the concept and whose scientists had contributed to the early theoretical work, could not produce one in meaningful quantities while simultaneously managing the demands of its other war production programs. Only American industry, with its combination of mass production expertise, precision manufacturing capability, available workforce, and sheer industrial scale, could take a laboratory curiosity and transform it into 22 million battlefield weapons in under 3 years. After the war, when German and Japanese military leaders and scientists were interrogated about Allied technology, the proximity fuse consistently ranked among the developments that had surprised them most. General der Artillerie Karl Toholt, who had commanded German artillery formations on the Western Front, described the proximity fuse as one of the most effective and demoralizing weapons his forces had encountered. Japanese naval officers who had commanded carrier task forces in the Pacific described the sudden infantry breakthroughs into battlefield realities within months. The shell that thinks. That was how some American ordnance officers described the proximity fuse, informally and always behind closed doors. It was not a precisely accurate description. The fuse did not think. It transmitted, received, measured, and triggered. But in a world where every other artillery shell was blind, a shell that could sense its target and act on that information was something closer to thinking than anything that had come before. And for the German and Japanese forces on the receiving end, the distinction between a shell that thought and a shell that merely seemed to think was, in the final accounting, academic. These stories cost something to live through. The least we can do is remember them. If this one meant something to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next. A like helps more people find these videos, and the comments here have become something special. Veterans' descendants sharing what their families never talked about. Be part of that. I'll see you next time.